of the MPs are going to like Regan.
Hello, everyone. If everyone can take their seats, please, we'll get started. I love that Dr. Hawkins has his dog with him. I can see. All right, just a little bit of logistics to let you know how the earpieces work. It's plugged in down on the bottom. You'll find it to your right or to your left. There's a small earpiece. If you want to plug that in and put that up on your ear, and then this little gadget in front of you needs to be set to English. So the bottom where the ear is, the little ear, just push it one over and it should go to English. So that way we'll be in full translation. So we're ready for anyone wanting to speak either of our official languages. So my name is Tracey Ramsey. I'm a member of Parliament for Essex, and I would like to thank all of our guests here from various Lyme groups across Canada, as well as those who are Skyping into us or coming to us by webinar. And I would really like to thank all of the MPs who are in the room with us. In particular, I'd like to thank the Speaker of the House of Commons, Jeff Regan, who has joined us as well. I really do think that it speaks to the incredible amount of work that all of you have been doing on the ground. We had a great response to this, and I believe there are a lot of staff members in the back of the room who are representing MPs as well who could not be here. So I want to welcome you all to this presentation today from a variety of voices, very important voices, on a critical health issue that we're facing in Canada, and that's Lyme disease. For myself, there's a very special person in the room who introduced me to Lyme, and because of her story and the people in my area and what they have been facing, I have become a part, I think, of the Lyme family and trying to help them in their advocacy. And that's Cheryl Abbott. She's from, in the back there, yes, Cheryl. So Cheryl is from my region, and she's an incredible woman who has put together a support group, which many of you in the room I know are part of support groups across the country, part of advocacy and part of the work that you do. So I want to thank you and really let you know that I'm here for your support, and I hope that other MPs will learn about what you have been facing and what Lyme has meant to each of you and become advocates for you as well. So with that being said, I will turn over the floor. We have a packed agenda. The first part of our presentation is going to happen with Sue Faber and Jennifer Kravis from Lyme Hope. We have Jim Wilson, who is the president of CanLyme, and we have Rosanna Magnotta from the G. Magnotta Foundation. So I will turn it over to you folks to begin our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracey, and thank you to everybody who's made time to be here. It's wonderful to see so many faces. I'm Jennifer Kravis. This is my Sue Faber and I are co-founders of Lyme Hope, and because we have a very tight agenda, I'll make this very brief. On the table, there are a couple copies of the Canadian petition. It's organized by province and alphabetical by city, so if you want to pass it around, you can actually read directly what your own constituents are saying. That's just for your information. And we have some amazing kids here today. We have Emma and Daniel who are going to share with you their really inspiring work that they're doing to raise awareness across Canada. And as well, we have a couple of amazing physicians who are going to share their experience with us, and Dr. Mulaney Wills as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim and Rosanna to introduce themselves.
Yes, I'm Jim Wilson. I'm president and founder of the Canadian Lyme Disease Foundation. CanLyme was founded in 2003, and it's been a lot of years and a lot of struggle for a lot of people trying to get the situation improved in Canada, and I hope with all of your interest here today, we're going to continue to move forward in the right direction. So thanks everybody for coming.
That was nice and short.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Magnotta, founder of the G. Magnotta Foundation for Vector-Borne Diseases. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Magnotta Winery, and I'm honored to be speaking with you, our elected representatives in our nation's capital, speaking about Lyme disease. 9 years ago, my husband and co-founder passed away from the effects associated with Lyme disease. As an avid outdoorsman, he often went hunting with his friends in different parts of the globe where ticks can be found. He contracted the bacteria that causes Lyme disease and suffered for years. I'm not sure you wouldn't be surprised if I told you that we had not heard much about Lyme disease when my husband was first diagnosed, but you might be surprised to learn the healthcare system didn't know much about Lyme disease either. Not enough is known about how to diagnose and treat the disease or about the bacteria itself. In the absence of this knowledge, people suffer. So in 2012, in memory of my husband, I created the G. Magnata Foundation for Vector-Borne Diseases to get to the bottom of Lyme disease. Our mission is to develop a better diagnostic test, better treatments, and better care by raising money to conduct world-class research. We have become a beacon of hope to thousands of people across the country affected by Lyme disease. After an exhaustive search, we partnered with the University of Guelph, a world-renowned research institution in the field of molecular biology, and are donating $1.4 million over 3 years to establish the G. Magnata Lyme Disease Research Lab. We are proud to have found an expert, Dr. Melanie Wills, to serve as director. Remember her name, Dr. Melanie Wills. She is leading a national effort to learn as much as we can about Lyme disease bacteria and to discover new ways to diagnose and treat the disease. I hope as members of Parliament you will support research funding that leverages the funding from our foundation to finally find the answers we need to help patients across Canada suffering from Lyme disease. We are getting closer to our goals, but we need all stakeholders, political parties of all stripes, governments, patients, researchers, healthcare providers, and clinicians working together as a charitable foundation raising money for the effort. We are prepared to do our part to fight Lyme disease. Thank you, and special thanks to the organizers for providing me the opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you.
Okay, before we move on, I just want to say that Randy Hoback was meant to co-sponsor this with me, but unfortunately he had to go stay at another event he and I were both at. There's a Canada-US group that's here, so he sends his regrets. I would like to recognize MP Elizabeth May, who I know all of you know quite well, for her work as well on supporting you. So now I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Melanie Wills.
Thank you very much. And Rosanna, after that wonderful introduction, I don't think I need to say much more about myself. I am the director of the... Oh, you're mic'd. I am mic'd, sorry. I'm the director of the G. Magnata Lyme Disease Research Lab at the University of Guelph. And it's a privilege to be here today to share my perspectives on Lyme in Canada as a scientist. So I am mindful of the time and our time limitations, but I would like to cover some ground because this is a very important topic. So I'd like to speak about what Lyme disease is, the ecological challenges, clinical challenges, the scientific frontiers that we're faced with, and how we can move forward together. So Lyme disease, as many of us know, is a bacterial infection caused by Borrelia burgdorferi and related spirochetal pathogens. It is maintained in nature in small rodents like mice, and so it's considered a tick-vectored zoonotic disease. That means that a tick can feast from the blood of an infected mammal. It acquires the infection, and then it can transmit it to an unlucky human. We tend to think of Lyme disease as developing in 3 stages. The first stage is when it's initially injected by the tick vector, and this can manifest... Sorry, is there an issue?
You have no translation.
The microphone's too far from her. It's too hard to hear what you say.
You need to bring the mic a little closer.
Or if you could turn on the mics in front of you as well.
She's got such a fragile voice.
Is this better?
Is that better? And? Can you try again?
Yeah.
Oh, it wasn't translating.
Oh, okay.
That's better.
Better?
Okay. So we think of Lyme disease as developing in 3 stages. The first is an early localized disease when the pathogen is initially transmitted by the tick. And this can manifest in a bullseye or EM rash, but does not always do so. If it does, that is diagnostic of Lyme disease. This can manifest also with flu-like symptoms that can be minor to severe. In the early disseminated phase, the pathogen moves from the bite site to inhabit the rest of the body. So it actually uses the vasculature to move to remote sites. This can cause fatigue, weakness, neurological manifestations, cardiac, more skin manifestations. So for example, you can get remote rashes, and it can also affect the eyes. In the late disseminated state, this is assuming that we haven't been treated, this can manifest in musculoskeletal symptoms, so arthritis, also neurological, affecting memory, concentration, and there's a host of other symptoms. In Canada, we consider a diagnosis based on 3 essential criteria. A doctor will be looking for potential manifestation of the erythromigrans, rash and or tick exposure, a clinical presentation, so how do your symptoms align with what is known about Lyme disease, and they will also be, they tend to look at laboratory tests, and this is based on a 2-tiered indirect assessment, and I will go into more detail about that. And the recommended treatment protocol, if you meet those criteria, is an antibiotic course of 14 to 21 days. A lot of people wonder why we're concerned about Lyme disease. Why is it a problem? Well, it is an escalating health threat in Canada. Bioclimatic modeling has shown that the tick vector, the habitat, is actually expanding with climate change. And they estimate that by 2020, 80% of inhabitants of eastern Canada will live in a suitable habitat. So our numbers are rising, and we know this. We also know that infected ticks are being dropped in Canada on migratory birds. As they fly from the United States, they can pick up an infectious tick in, for example, Lyme, Connecticut, and they can deposit it in Toronto. And so this is another route of entry. And I like to put this in perspective using a case study of a young woman known as Sophie, who was, in her prime, she was a varsity athlete at a Toronto university, great student, obviously very athletically gifted. And suddenly she had face and arm numbness, heart palpitations, hair loss, blinding headaches, fatigue, brain fog, burning feet, stiffening joints, decreasing mobility, and gastrointestinal disturbances. She had a number of different consultations. She went to emergency medicine, and they didn't know what to do with her. She went to general practice, neurology, rheumatology. She had numerous prescriptions, none of which helped her, and many of which made her more ill. She asked, could I possibly have Lyme disease? And the answer was, well, there's no Lyme disease in Ontario, and you live in a city. She had no known tick exposure. She had no rash. And on our Canadian diagnostic tests, she was negative. So from the 3 criteria that I told you, she did not have Lyme disease. However, a clinician in Toronto, a specialist, decided that her symptoms were compelling. He diagnosed her with Lyme disease and put her on a course of antibiotics. After 8 weeks of doxycycline, she saw a 90% recovery in her symptoms. And I should note that 8 weeks is around 3 times longer than clinicians are normally able to prescribe antibiotics for Lyme disease. And we would actually say that Sophie was one of the lucky ones, because it can take a lot longer than 8 weeks to see a resolution of symptoms. Now, at her 12-year follow-up, she was unfortunately unable to resume competitive athletics, and she had some lingering symptoms. So how did we get here? What confluence of factors is allowing people like Sophie to initially fall through the cracks? I look at it as 4 different things that are really impacting the way that we process Lyme disease in Canada. One is our perception of risk. So for surveillance, we use the dot of doom. That is to say, there's a point on a map at which Lyme-infected ticks have been found in nature, and it is falsely presumed that outside of that range, your risk is 0, when it is not. There's a question of other transmission modes. For example, it's come up in the literature, questions of contact-mediated, sexual-mediated, congenital transmission. We have lab diagnostics that are failing people because of technical limitations. So the sensitivity in acute cases is about 40%, and that's because at the optimal window of antibiotic intervention, your body has not had a chance to mount a robust immune response that would allow it to be positive on this test. We also have a number of false negatives due to a multitude of factors, including the design of the test around a laboratory indicator strain that is not necessarily indicative of what people are encountering in nature today, and the fact that the Lyme bacterium can actually subvert the immune system. Importantly, the current testing also cannot report the resolution of the infection. So we don't know when we should stop treatment because we do not have a direct test for this pathogen. The symptoms are also vague, and they can be attributed to other causes. So there's mimicry of arthritis, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, and dementia. And in terms of prognosis, we know that there are persistent symptoms that can occur in some patients, but of course a hotly contested issue is whether this is a result of persistent infection. So there was a really elegantly designed study in the United States. It was a prospective cohort study where they enrolled people with early disease and they evaluated their health outcomes. So they gave them the textbook antibiotic intervention and they monitored to see who got well. And luckily, a number of people did. Unfortunately, 36% of patients did not recover to their former state of health. They had new onset fatigue, neurocognitive issues, and musculoskeletal issues. And that has henceforth taken on the designation of post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. We also have chronic Lyme disease, which is believed to arise from a long-standing case of Lyme disease that was just never recognized in that initial state before the pathogen had a chance to disseminate. In the animal, and I won't belabor this point, but animal models are really helpful to us because scientists can give the animal the infection and do a number of assessments to see how their body is processing them. And the rhesus monkey was used not only because it's a non-human primate model of disease, but also because the pharmacokinetics are similar to the human. So they process the antibiotics as similar to the way that we would. And what they discovered, so they gave the monkeys either chronic Lyme disease or their model of post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. And they evaluated the tissue to see did they have evidence of persistence of the pathogen in these monkeys. And for chronic Lyme disease, the answer was yes. What surprised a lot of people, in post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, the answer was also yes. And this has been shown in case studies in humans as well. This is not an exhaustive list. This is a snapshot of various studies in the United States and Europe that have used various means to detect the persistence of the pathogen in humans after antibiotic treatment. So clearly this is a big problem and we need a big and ambitious solution. And so what we are doing is we're connecting existing Lyme disease research nodes across Canada so that we hit Lyme disease at the ecological level. So for example, looking at environmental surveillance, veterinary medicine, pathogen and vector sequencing. We're trying to develop novel anti-Borrelia compounds, and we're also understanding how the organism interacts with the human so that we better predict the patterns of these diseases and how we can diagnose them. Ultimately, this will inform epidemiology, health policy, and medical practice. At the end of the day, we believe that this Canadian Lyme Consortium can bring considerable evidence to bear in this long-standing debate. And we would like ultimately to be able to contribute meaningfully to the objectives set forth in the federal framework on Lyme disease. But we also ask that the framework is reviewed after 3 years. We know that at the time it was published, it did not incorporate all relevant science up to that date. And we also realize that science is advancing rapidly. So we would like to ask for a review of the framework after 3 years that integrates new evidence. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Milani, so much for that overview. Everyone has, I think, the deck on their desktop. And also, just so you're aware, the meeting is being recorded and it will be available online after this. So we're going to move on. I think we'll hold questions till the end because we have quite a few presenters. And our next one is quite special. It's Daniel Steimers, and he is 11 years old. He told me he's in grade 6. And he is founder of the LET, the Lyme Education Team. And I think, Daniel, you're looking quite spiffy. I really love the green tie today. And we're all quite lucky to have you here with us. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay. I'm sure you have all heard the term Lyme disease before. Maybe from family, or your neighbors, or from one of these people speaking here today. Lyme disease is an epidemic, and I'm going to tell you how it almost ruined my life. First of all, I was not bitten by a tick. I was born with Lyme disease, meaning it is congenital. One day, while I was playing, I suddenly dropped to the ground. The world was spinning, I couldn't stand, and people were upside down. These vertigo episodes would happen randomly and more frequently as time went on. Dizzy spells and clumsiness became a problem at school. My friends counted how many times I fell off my chair that year. The total was 109. Other symptoms that would plague me included night sweats, going to bed freezing cold and waking up drenched in sweat, heavy feeling legs that would cause me to sit out activities, even hockey games, extreme noise sensitivity, and mood swings and rage. To find out what was going on, I was taken to every type of doctor: neurologist, neurosurgeon, cardiologist, endocrinologist, gastroenterologist, ENT, infectious disease specialist, and an ophthalmologist. The only diagnosis I received out of all of that was possible childhood migraines, yet the symptoms continued to happen. I wouldn't be symptom-free and standing here today if I hadn't been lucky enough to have a family friend suggest exploring the possibilities of Lyme disease. I was one of the many Canadians who had to travel to the USA for better testing, diagnosis, and proper treatment of Lyme disease. Should Canadians have to go outside of Canada to get treatment for a disease that has been around for years upon years? Over a period of 3 years, my American doctor treated me with antibiotics and antimalarials as well as herbal medications. My infection needed that long for complete treatment, as Lyme had 7 years, my entire life, to spread to my brain, liver, spleen, muscles, and everywhere. The medicine was really disgusting, and I actually got sick from them a couple times. The worst part was not being able to have sugar. It was awful, but it was so worth it. Having untreated Lyme disease was really unpleasant. Going through 3 years of treatment was also very unpleasant and difficult. But I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity to be treated and now be symptom-free and healthy. Who knows what my life would be like today if my infection remained undiagnosed. Having seen firsthand what Lyme disease can do to a family, I felt that I had to do my part to raise both awareness and money for Lyme disease prevention, treatment, and research. Last year, I started LET, or Lyme Education Team, an organization trying to spread awareness about Lyme disease. Last year at my school, we hosted a Lyme Awareness Day and raised $240 for the CanLyme Foundation. This year, we are reaching out to at least 2 more schools. I posted my first educational video on YouTube, and I have been asked to speak at numerous events and discussions. I have also been asked to be a guest on Roger's Georgina Life TV show, talk in front of my town council, and will be making more awareness videos soon. I'm not here today for publicity. I'm not here today to be a hero. I'm here today because I care. Most people in this building care. Hundreds and thousands of Canadians care, and I need you to care as well. My Lyme infection wasn't from an unlucky tick bite. It could have been prevented if my mom was screened for Lyme disease before I was even born. I challenge each of you to take action by helping to allow doctors to treat chronic Lyme disease here in Canada, and by acknowledging that congenital Lyme disease is occurring and to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So next we have Dr. Ralph Hawkins, who's joining us by video, and he is the Clinical Associate Professor at the University of Calgary, the site lead for General Internal Medicine at the Calgary South Health Campus, and plenary speaker at Public Health Agency of Canada, sponsored the Framework on Lyme Disease Conference. Those in the Lyme community, I think, know Dr. Hawkins well, so I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Daniel is an extremely difficult act to follow. I'm amazed if he's this articulate at age 11. I think some of you MPs in the room probably have to watch out for your jobs in not too very long. I've been asked to talk about the journey of Lyme disease patients from the time that they have their tick bite in the early stages that they go through the medical system. And from the time that a tick bite occurs, within 72 hours, there may be the development of the bullseye rash or the erythema migrans rash that occurs. This happens only 50% of cases. Of course, my dogs have been silent for the entire time until this moment. The erythema migrans rash will show up about 50% of the time, and it isn't always characteristic in the shape of a bullseye. More commonly, it is just a red, round rash that gradually expands. A A study that's been done looking at the erythema migrans rash identifies that primary care doctors or emergency room physicians will recognize the classic bullseye appearance about 80% of the time, but if it is not typical looking, they'll only recognize it 2/3 of the time. And once it is recognized as an erythema migrans rash, a study in Canada has demonstrated that only 58% of doctors will actually feel comfortable to intervene with antibiotic therapy. What that means is that 70% of people are identified as having a rash, and then only 60% of them are treated with antibiotics. Only the minority are actually properly treated if they're showing up with the clinical diagnosis of Lyme disease. The rest of these patients
I don't know if you can hear us, Dr. Hawkins, but we've lost the feed.
It's his computer apparently that froze.
Okay. All right, maybe we'll move on, and then if he's able to come back and join us, we'll loop him in. All right, so next up we have Dr. Adrian Baranchuk, who is a professor of medicine at Queen's University. He's the president of the International Society of Electrocardiology, an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Electrocardiology, vice president in Canada of the Inter-American Society of Cardiology. And again, it's another physician's perspective talking about Lyme carditis and the electrical system of the heart. So welcome, Dr. Baranchuk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you this presentation. I can't see the screen from here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my own presentation, and I will request somebody in the room to pass the slides. Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you, are you guys able to see the front slide, right?
Yes. Yep, we're good. It's up.
Okay. So what I'm going to show you today is one of the acute manifestations of Lyme, which is the affection of the heart, and more specifically of the electricity of the heart. So I'm going to try to be not technical, but to show you some stuff that I'm sure you will be able to understand. The first case that I had to face was a young man of 35 years of age that presented with a little bit of dizziness. He attended the ER a couple of times with quite vague symptoms and a completely normal cardiovascular exam. This is his first ECG, where you see that the big spikes that are facing up are quite few. Every little bump in the ECG should be followed by one of these big spikes. A couple of hours later, you can see that now he's having very little of those big spikes and many of the little bumps. That is indicating that his electricity is failing, and very soon he will evolve of having no cardiac beat and mostly die because of this condition. When we have this type of electrical disorder, what we have to do is through the leg or the neck to put a temporary wire, which is a little cable that goes into the heart and helps saving the cardiac beat. Once this was done at a different hospital than the Kingston General Hospital, a full interrogation was done, and most of the constitutional symptoms associated with Lyme disease were present. He was a pastoral in a rural church here in the near zone from Kingston, and on closer interrogation, he did recall an insect bite on his calf. So my colleagues phoned me to put a pacemaker, a permanent pacemaker in this patient, and after listening to the story, we requested serology to be sent immediately and antibiotics to be started while transferring the patient to Kingston. So by day 3, as you can see now, are more of those big spikes, indicating that the electricity of the heart is slowly recovering. By day 5, now we have almost 1-to-1 of the small bumps to the big spikes, indicating that the electricity is returning to normal. At this day, we were able to take the temporary wire out of the body and just keep the patient on antibiotics, and you see how the things are improving. By day 10 of antibiotics with the patient admitted in hospital, this is almost a normal ECG, and by day 11, we invited the patient to go to a treadmill test where he completed a completely normal test, reaching a heart rate of almost 180 beats per minute, which is fantastic for any of us at that age. By day 12, the ECG completely normalized, and the patient was discharged home, follow-up at 4 and 6 weeks with a completely normal state of health and a normal electrocardiogram. So what we learned from this case is that evaluating the conduction system before the patient's going home is a reassurance for the patient and for the health team that the electricity of the heart was completely recovered. What I want my fellow MPs to understand is that the standard of practice for any high-degree electrical block is to put a permanent pacemaker. But the batteries of the permanent pacemaker last between 7 to 9 years. So if we do this to a young fellow like Daniel in the room, or to some of my patients that were 14 years of age, then what will require is at least 6 to 7 surgeries through life to replace those batteries. It's not only the economic cost to the healthcare system, but it's also that every time that we have to open the pocket where the battery is placed, there is a risk of 2 to 3% of a serious infection. All that versus keeping the patient 10 days in hospital with antibiotics that are not particularly expensive for having an absolute normal life for the rest of the life. This is the follow-up ECG, which is completely normal. I'm not going to go back to describe what Lyme disease is, just to remind you all that Lyme carditis is one of the early dissemination forms of Lyme disease, as you can see in this slide. This is a summary of the endemic regions. As it was said by Melanie, not living in an endemic region is a guarantee that you are not going to have Lyme because of all the migration, not only of animals, but also of people. So we have all to be aware of these possibilities. In the last 18 months, we have identified 5 patients, all of them male, younger than 40 years old, presenting with this condition called high-degree atrioventricular block. That means a shutdown of the electricity that, according to our own guidelines, should require the use of a permanent pacemaker for the rest of your life. These 5 cases were treated with antibiotics. Only 2 of them required temporary pacing during the first 5 days. All of them had a stress test showing that the electrical system was absolutely normal at the time of discharge. All of them were follow-up, indicating the absence of permanent damage to the cardiac system. All this was achieved with antibiotics for 10 days at the hospital and then continuation of antibiotic treatment at home. Most of these things were mentioned already. Just to take a look to the picture so you can see how that so-called erythema migrans looks like. So one of the problems that we find is that doctors across the province and across the country are not aware of Lyme carditis and the presentation with high-degree AV block. And this is why we are trying to advance some mnemonic rules to help doctors to remember this. This is one more case where you can see from day 1 to day 12 a complete resolution of the atrioventricular block using antibiotics. And for that, I will show you a couple of acronyms that we think may help people to remember about this condition. First, A, this is a disease that affects predominantly young individuals. B, the bite tick. Most of the patients do not recall spontaneously, and some of them not even with guidance being bitten by a tick. C, the unexplained conduction disease that refers to the electrical problem of the heart. D, for the dermatology rash that was previously shown and explained by my colleagues, and E for endemic regions. And that has to be properly interrogated. Patients may not belong to an endemic region, but recognizing being outdoors in endemic regions across the country. So when a young individual presents with high degree AV block, which is a common condition for people above 65 years of age, but very uncommon in a young fellow in his teenager years, please think Lyme carditis. And then we developed this silk score that has been validated and will be presented in the Cardiovascular Congress, the Cardiovascular Society Congress in Toronto in a few months. We developed this silk score, and silk stands for Suspicious Index on Lyme carditis. And the co-star, as you can see, are the variables that we've been talking through the day today, and assigning few different points to each one of those conditions. That will help doctors to identify possible patients with Lyme carditis, and rather than jumping into the conclusion that they need an expensive per-life treatment, just treat them initially with antibiotics while receiving the results of the serology and confirming the presence of Lyme disease. These are the first two papers that were published in high impact factor journals. In the next few weeks is coming a paper in the Canadian Medical Association journal called 5 Things to Know About Lyme Carditis and High Degree AV Block. We finished work in Mexico to raise awareness of this situation in that country. We're working now in China, where there are several regions and provinces that are affected by Lyme. So my 2 cents for this discussion is we need your help to prospectively validate the silk score. We want to be sure that the points that we allocated to each one of the variables will properly identify patients with this condition, which can be treated with antibiotics, and to avoid the life experience that Daniel told us so eloquently. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Baranchuk. And I think we'll go back to Dr. Hawkins for a couple of minutes to finish his presentation.
Thank you very much. I will wrap up my presentation pretty quickly. The gist of my presentation is that when patients present with acute Lyme disease, they don't always have the rash. If you do have the rash, it is not always recognized. If it is recognized, it isn't always treated. Those who don't have the rash, if they're sent for laboratory tests, the laboratory tests give you less than 50-50 likelihood of identifying the disease. So in a clinical setting, patients presenting in Canada with Lyme disease, whether they have the erythema migrans rash or not, the majority will culminate in inadequate recognition of the disease and inadequate treatment because of the inadequate recognition. So the majority of Lyme disease patients are not being properly assessed and treated acutely. That's my point. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hawkins. We'll now move on to Sue Faber, who is an RN, so happy Nursing Week to you, Sue, and the co-founder of Lyme Hope, to give us a nurse's perspective, patient first treatment of Lyme disease, and the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario resolution on Lyme disease.
Thank you so much. So I am a registered nurse. Most of my practice, most of my experience is an emergency room nurse, and then working in the community in Ontario. And I just wanted to share briefly with you today that I've been working hard with other nurses, and a resolution on Lyme disease has just been passed at the RNAO AGM a couple of weeks ago. And this is very, very powerful and important, because in this resolution we are identifying and acknowledging patients all across Canada and of course in Ontario who are not getting the support and the help that they need. We're identifying issues around chronic presentations of Lyme disease, not just acute. So as Dr. Hawkins pointed out, if that patient never gets acknowledged for that tick bite and then progresses with symptomology beyond that point, a lot of times these patients are missed and they are not treated and they are not helped, and they are sent to all kinds of subspecialists, and oftentimes at the end they're actually sent to psychiatry because people just don't believe that this could be happening to their body. So in this petition comments, you will see story after story after story from every province, every territory across Canada, patients saying the same thing: I need help, please listen, I have an illness, I need treatment. And so the nurses have listened, and this resolution is powerful. As a result of this resolution passing, I've had nurses from every province, not every province, from many provinces across Canada reach out to me directly, wanting to do a similar resolution in their province. And just one other thing I want to address here is what Daniel had briefly mentioned, was there are alternate modes of transmission of Lyme disease. It's not just a tick bite. Literature shows that Lyme disease can be passed from mother to baby in utero. The problem with this, of course, is that the baby's going to be infected from birth. But the other issue at hand is that baby has an immature immune system and will not be able to produce antibody to test positive on a test. So these babies are going unacknowledged, untreated. These babies then become children who then have issues like Daniel, where they are sent all over the place and nobody knows what's wrong with them. We know of families all across Canada where all the children in the family have Lyme disease, not just one. And so this would be a true indicator that this, yes, indeed, can be passed from mother to child. So this is just but one thing that's included in this resolution, and that in Canada we need to actively address this and move forward with this to support and help Canadian men, women, and children. And I'm just proud to be a member of the RNAO to have been a part of this. So I just want to thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And on to our next really special guest here that's joining us today, and is Emma Smashnook. And Emma is 14. She is a Lyme sufferer and advocate, and she's the founder of Emma's Lyme Ribbon Campaign. So Emma, I will turn the floor over to you.
Hi, my name is Emma Smashnook, and I'm 14 years old. I'm battling chronic Lyme disease. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. Merci de me laisser partager mon histoire avec vous. Sorry. 4 years ago, my mom found a bullseye rash on the back of my leg. I didn't get sick right away, so my doctor told us there is nothing to worry about. 2 years later, I started getting symptoms, and our doctor sent us to Sick Kids in Toronto. Over the next year, they ran a lot of tests, but found nothing. I had over 50 symptoms and was in pain all the time, but my test results were all normal. My doctor decided that I was perfectly healthy and that I was probably just stressed. Then one morning, I called my mom to my room and told her that I felt like my brain wasn't talking to my legs. I was trying to walk, but all I was doing was stumbling around. Then the tremors started. Every day was a new and scary symptom. Then she went back to that bullseye rash and decided to find out more about Lyme disease. My Sick Kids specialist told us Lyme disease isn't a big enough problem in Canada, so we don't have anyone who deals with it. Our family doctor said, Lyme disease is controversial. I could have treated you when you were first infected, but I can't treat it at this stage. My mom was furious. My doctor didn't know how to recognize Lyme when I first saw him, so now that we've given the bacteria a chance to take over my body and make me much sicker. And my doctor says he can't treat me. I'm just a kid, but even I can see how wrong that is. I want so badly to be able to explain to you what it's like to live in my body. I want you to know that it took every ounce of my mental and physical energy just to be here today, and I will probably be unable to get out of bed for several days when I get home. Lyme disease is not the simple illness people think it is. I've been through every symptom you can imagine. At first, I had excruciating stomach pain and nausea all day, every day. I lost 20% of my body weight. I've had muscle tremors so strong that I feel like I've been hit by a truck. The exhaustion is the worst. I spend almost all my time in bed. Most days, my only activity is to get from my bed to the bathroom and back again. My vision is blurry. I have extreme light sensitivity. I have pain when I go to the bathroom, walk, or move too quickly. I have a sore throat, shortness of breath, and my brain messes with me all the time. Sometimes my brain just stops processing and working, and I can't speak or explain what I'm feeling to my mom. Lyme messes with your emotions too. Sometimes I feel angry, sad, happy, for no reason. Before I found treatment, I told my mom that I wished I could go to sleep and never wake up. I didn't want to imagine living like this forever. I can understand why people with Lyme have committed suicide, and it makes me sad. If you don't have a supportive family, if you can't afford to pay for your own treatment, and if your doctor tells you that you're just stressed, life can seem hopeless. It is that bad for some people. My mom talks to me about not giving up hope. I trusted that if I was sick, I could go to the doctor and they would help me. I planned for the future, for when I could get better and resume life. But dates came and went with no progress, and I felt naive for putting so much faith in them. Even though I have a good Lyme doctor now, it's hard to think about the future. I'm afraid when I'm better, I could just go outside and get infected all over again. I don't know how long it will take for me to get better, or if I will ever have a normal life. Will I be able to pick up with my friends where we left off 2 years ago? Will I ever be able to trust doctors? Lyme has affected my entire family. My mom has put everything else on hold to work on getting me better. My stepdad has built wheelchair ramps and a new shower for me, and he has to carry me places when I'm too tired to move on my own. I have younger siblings who are 2, 4, and 9. Even at their ages, they help take care of me, and I know that they are worried about how long I've been sick for. I'm so lucky to have them in my life. Being sick and stuck in bed for days on end is hard. I keep myself busy with projects. One day I came up with the idea to make Lyme ribbons so that we can spread awareness. My mom helps me to mail them, and we encourage people to wear them proudly and post and share pictures on our Facebook page. The hope is that by getting more people to wear the Lyme ribbons, we can stop other children from ending up like me. I've brought enough ribbons for everyone at our meeting today, and I hope that you join us in spreading awareness. I can't change the past, but I'm hoping that you will help change the future. Lyme disease will only continue to grow. It makes me angry to think that if my little sister or brothers got Lyme today, my mom would have to fight just as hard to get them treatment while we watch them get sicker. We need Health Canada to get the right information to our doctors so that they know how to recognize Lyme and give people what they need. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Emma, so much for sharing your story and for the strength and the courage that it took for you even to be here today. For those of us who know someone who has Lyme, your story is repeated over and over again. And so I know how much it took for you to come here today, and I thank you very much for that effort. And I hope that the days ahead are better, and that you, find some hope in spreading your message through your Lyme Ribbon campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, we'll turn over to Jennifer Kravis and Sue Faber to finish us up, and then we'll have some time for some questions.
Yes, we don't have a lot of time left, so we'll make it really brief and then turn it over for questions. But I would just like to say, you may be asking now, what can you do? What can we do to help? These kids are amazing. What they're doing is fantastic, but these kids should not be the ones having to go out and raise awareness for this disease. We should not be having our children having to fight this battle by themselves. Each of you has a black folder, and in the black folder is a joint and unanimous recommendation from all of us that the framework needs to be reviewed sooner, as Dr. Wills pointed out. The framework is not scheduled to be reviewed again until 5 years after it was issued, which is 2022. And we're asking that the framework be reviewed in 2020, so that'll be 3 years after it was released, and every 2 years after that, since, as Dr. Wills pointed out, the science is emerging so rapidly and there's still many, many gaps that need to be addressed. And now I'd just like to say thank you to all our speakers and turn it over to some questions.
Just one more thing about the anchor. Oh, yes. I just want to share one more thing. In your package, you'll also see there is a letter in there from a mom. She wanted you to read this letter. Her son who ended his life because nobody would help him for Lyme disease. So that letter is in English and in French for you to read. And also each one of you will receive this little anchor with the word hope on it. And I ask that you just hold on to that, because this is the hope of Canadians across this country, that you as MPs will listen, will engage, and will start speaking out on behalf of those who feel they have no voice. Lyme Hope, we are all about being anchored in hope and integrity. So thank you very much for listening today, and we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Sue and Jennifer. Mark, we'll go here first.
Thank you very much. Thank you, MP Ramsey and MP Hoback, I guess, for co-hosting this, and thank you to all of you for being here and sharing your stories and your expert information that you have. I'm the Member of Parliament for Kingston. We have a high degree of Lyme just based on the way that it had traveled, and I started to study this topic probably about 4 years ago, and in about 2 years into it, my father-in-law developed this really big bruise on his leg. Didn't have a bullseye or anything like that. It was a big bruise, and he was told by his doctor, that's a spider bite, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. 2 years later, he started to develop symptoms that sounded a lot like Lyme, but doctors refused to accept that it would be Lyme. And then finally, after pushing from a couple people that he knew, the medical community was kind of forced to do the testing, and then they discovered that he did have Lyme disease. He's been treated for it since, but to this day he continues to have symptoms in his hands and his feet that are from Lyme disease. When I was studying this, I heard a lot of different information about Lyme and whether or not it's even curable. To be completely honest, I spoke with the Chief Medical Officer of Health in our region, and he told me Lyme disease is curable, but the symptoms that it creates because of the work that the bacteria does is not curable. And so I guess I have, three questions for Dr. Wells, I think, or Wills. First is, why does it take the medical community? Why is the medical community so far in different directions on this in terms of their willingness to, because I think that's one of the underlying issues that we need to get at. Two, is Lyme disease curable or is it not? Because that seems to be a debate that rages on. And three, why can my dog get a vaccine for Lyme disease, but as a human I can't?
Those are big questions. How long do you have? Want to take me for a coffee afterwards?
I'd love to hear the answers.
So, so your question about is Lyme disease curable? I will preface this by saying that the clinical trials that were done with antibiotics were done in acute cases. So when they say that doxycycline clears the infection, they were looking at people who had rashes at that point. No one has gone in and done a large-scale clinical trial on people who were several years in and vetted that doxycycline hits the bug in that state. So there are in vitro studies now, for example, that are looking at the different morphologies of the bacterium. So initially when it's injected into the system, we believe it's in a free swimming state. So this is a single bacterium in what we call a planktonic form. In culture, so when we grow these bacteria in broth medium, so it's a liquid culture, they will take on a what they call a more resistant form or a persistent form after they hit what we call a stationary phase. So they believe this is a very primitive model of what might be happening in the body. When these bacteria go into clumps or biofilm-like conformations, they're not readily accessible to drugs like doxycycline. So your first line antibiotics are not as potent anymore, essentially. So the question, is Lyme disease curable, becomes to me, are we using the right tools? If we use the right tools and we're still dealing with an infection, then yes, it is. But we have to go back and re-ask that question. And I'm going to actually direct this at our medical personnel as well, Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Branchuk.
So the answer that I would give to that question would derive from some case report from the literature from the 1990s, where cure rates have been reported if the disease is treated within the first year in the magnitude of 20%. Cure rates reported if the disease has been present between 1 and 3 years of 10%, and cure rates of disease that is longer than 3 years duration of 5%. What I derive from that is the clear understanding that the longer that the disease is present, the more likely it is to persist and linger. But cure is indeed possible.
I would like to add up. First of all, thank you so much, Mark, for being there and representing us and being so engaged. It's a true honor to see you there. So I think that there is a time frame window where we can act and resolve some of the most serious conditions associated with the acute Lyme. The part that is on me, which is the cardiovascular impact of Lyme disease, 90% of the times is the conduction system that suffers. And I show you 5 local cases of people coming with the disease, coming with the severe conduction disorder, and leaving the hospital 10 or 12 days later, cured from that condition. Is that synonymous that that Lyme disease was completely cured? That I can't answer. I don't think that anybody can, to determine whether after a course of antibiotics the body is completely free of bacteria, and B, the body is completely free of antibodies that may attack the same body after having reacted against the bacteria. But the fact that the inflammation of the conduction system of the heart completely recovers in the first week, it's a true indication that at least the impact of the disease on the heart can be cured, and can be cured with antibiotics, and can be cured with the current antibiotics that we are using. I want everybody to remember that for this condition, as well as for many other infectious diseases, there's no test that guarantees cure. And that, even when it is our hope to find it, it's on developing. There's plenty of diseases similar to Lyme, where we have a lot of things to do. However, we lack a confirmatory test that the patient is absolutely cured.
Okay, we'll move to Elizabeth May.
Thank you, and thanks, Tracy, for organizing this. And it's good to see all of you again and meet some new advocates on Lyme disease. I'll just say, by way of opening, that when I brought forward the Lyme Disease Framework Act for first reading in 2012, I didn't think we'd get it through. I didn't know we'd have unanimous support. But what I really didn't think is that it would make such a small difference. I have to admit, I'm very disappointed, because the federal conference that was mandated by the Act in May of 2016 was extremely powerful. I know Mark was there a lot of the time. Dr. Hawkins, your testimony at that conference was just absolutely honest, bold, clear. Lyme disease patients are treated badly by their physicians I'm paraphrasing, but one of the things you shared with us. There's a bias against Lyme disease patients from their physicians. I don't understand this. There's an attitude problem that people with Lyme disease don't really have Lyme disease, or that Lyme disease doesn't really exist. And this is still pervasive through the medical community. So I'm going to speak bluntly, because when I go to one of the only reasons that between the great conference we had in May, the really unacceptable draft of a framework that came out first, the improvements to the framework that made me feel, okay, we've got something we can work with here. And here we are in spring of 2018, 2 years after the conference, with so little progress being made. The framework does point to something, and this is where my question comes in. The section on education and awareness, it very clearly says, I could quote from it, but I'll paraphrase, we need to educate frontline medical professionals. Public awareness, it talks about education of the public, but it also says we have to educate frontline health professionals. Very little of that can be done by the Minister of Health within the federal government. we have jurisdictional issues. We have medical professionals are a self-regulating profession. And let's be blunt, I think those of you who are Lyme advocates, we know of doctors who've gone out of their way and treated, well, it's their job to treat people who are sick. Doctors in this country who treat Lyme disease patients have been drummed out of the medical profession because they have treated Lyme disease patients. I know this is shocking for MPs to hear, but that's the reality. So what do we do with the jurisdictional morass that we have, with a mandate from the federal framework for Lyme that says we must educate frontline health professionals? We need more Lyme literate doctors. How do we get from here to there? I'm not directing this question to anyone who has suggestions. We're MPs, we have a federal framework on Lyme disease, we have a sympathetic Minister of Health, and yet we seem to be stuck with no progress in getting help for people who need it.
I'd like to chime in there too. With regards to the framework, the legislation was quite clear in what it asked for, and it did ask the government or compel the government to create guidelines. It did not do that. So basically the consultation with the patients and their experts ended with that conference, and we tried to become involved and engaged in the writing of the framework document, but we were refused. We were also told that it was going to be a completely in-house project, and even the Association of Medical Microbiology and Infectious Disease Doctors would not be participating. That was not true. We intercepted emails that they were invited to participate in the drafting of the document, but the patients were not. The framework was quite clear. Create guidelines. It didn't tell the federal government they had to impose guidelines on the provinces. The provinces have that jurisdiction, but it did compel the government to create guidelines. They completely failed, and basically it was almost like the bureaucrats were thumbing the nose at all of the members of parliament. And how dare you create a law and actually compel us to do something? And they completely ignored you. And it was a unanimous, overwhelming majority of people pushing this bill through. But yet there's not an ounce of guideline in that resultant document. And so I think we've got to all take a second hard look at that. Going back to the cardiac problems, my daughter wasn't recognized early enough to have that nice, easy few days or few weeks of antibiotics cure. She ended up requiring a permanent pacemaker in her heart. She got the pacemaker put in when she was 19. She's 34 now, has had it changed once already. That early diagnosis is being missed due to, in large part, that lack of education on our medical physicians. That's got to start right in medical school, and it's got to be, the curriculum has to be developed with the patients and their experts to make sure that the curriculum reflects the reality out there of what the people are suffering on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot that we can do, I think, as a country. We're going to have to work a lot harder because there's a systemic bias against Lyme disease built into our structure, and we will be presenting letters further outlining how that systemic bias is being put forward, and the effect it has on all of us. And it's going to affect, as people are sitting here, this disease is spreading in numbers incredibly. The last 2 years, the number of calls that we've been getting is just going up and up and up. And from areas just last Friday, I got a call from a woman in central interior of British Columbia. It says, I've been walking out here for 17 years. I've never seen a tick. This year, I've had 4 on me already. And the ticks are spreading. They're surviving the winters better. They're carrying the disease. The migratory birds are doing an extremely efficient job at transplanting these ticks. We've got to start taking this seriously because it's affecting a lot of people. And when we talk about cures, what Mulaney said about the proper tools. Right now, the hands are being tied of doctors. They're told you can only do this for this long. That's not working in many cases. If it isn't diagnosed early, we've had people, and there was a write-up in the Fort McMurray newspaper several years ago, a woman who was in a wheelchair for 10 years with an incorrect diagnosis, was re-diagnosed with Lyme disease, but her treatment took 2.5 years of antibiotics. But she got up and threw her wheelchair away and went back to work. So it's the tool, it's the time, and we can't box this disease in with these guidelines that are tying the hands of our doctors right now across Canada.
Thank you so much. I have 2 more questions. Diane Finley, do you want to go ahead?
Well, thank you. Thanks for organizing this. Thank you all for coming and sharing your stories.
Can you just put your mic on? Sorry, is your mic on?
I come from Haldimand, Norfolk, which is the home of Long Point Provincial Park, basically ground zero for Ontario, perhaps because it's on the migratory paths, 4 different ones. Just flipping through the petition there, I have 100 communities. I looked up 5 and counted over 25 people who said, I know people who, locally. And so when then I look at numbers that say that 5 years ago, there were fewer than 200 confirmed cases in all of Ontario. Those numbers don't match. They just don't match. And a friend of mine got a bite, got a rash, started having some of the symptoms, went to the doctor. First they told him it was MS. Then they said it was Alzheimer's. Then they thought it might be Lyme disease. But he was told that they cannot test for it in Ontario. He would have to go to Rochester. Now, my question there is, first of all, is it true? Secondly, do they have tools, techniques for diagnostics in Rochester that we don't have here? And if so, why don't we have them? Particularly as 6 years ago when Elizabeth was bringing her framework forward here, Ontario got a bill through on, in fact, it was my provincial counterpart, got a bill that got unanimous consent for an Ontario framework. So if and why has nothing happened there? Because implementation of these things, as has been pointed out, unfortunately, is 98% provincial. But about the diagnostics, I don't understand why they can do it in Rochester if they can, and not here.
Can I just speak briefly to this? We had a benchmark public opinion study that was done by a professional company in 2017. And we asked Canadians, do you or someone you know in Canada have Lyme disease? And a diagnosis of Lyme disease, either you or someone you know in Canada. And the answer was 11% said yes. So if you equate that to our population, we're looking at 4 million Canadians. So you're absolutely right when you say the numbers don't add up. So when we are hearing that there's, 500, 600, maybe 1,000 Canadians a year getting this disease, that is absolutely not the truth of what is going on across this country. So I just want to speak to that. I think Dr. Hawkins could nicely speak to the testing question that you have, ma'am.
Yes, the testing that's available in Ontario is the standard 2-tier testing. That would be the same test that would be applied in Rochester or applied in Europe. The interpretation of the testing is where the testing really falls apart. The test has been defined in such a way that when the test is done, it has to meet a number of criteria to be called positive. Adrian and I were talking before the official meeting started about his experience in China, and China has actually come up with its own definitions using the same test panel, but they've come up with their own definitions of what constitutes a positive test result for Lyme disease, which is far more sensitive than the Centers for Diseases Control or the Public Health Ontario approach. So there's no magic new fangled test that's available in Rochester that isn't available anywhere else. There may have been a need for a specialist to be involved in the care of this patient who may have been doing a lumbar puncture or some specialized tests on spinal fluid. I mean, we're getting into the medical aspects of the care, but there's nothing special that's available in the States that isn't available in Canada. It all has to do with the interpretation of the testing more so than the technology that's available. We're all subject to the same poor technology worldwide.
I'd just like to add one thing to that. So one of the differences between the U.S. test and the Canadian test, which the second test called the Western Blot, and as Dr. Hawkins pointed out, the difference is in interpretation. So I believe in China they require one band. The test comes back showing different banding patterns. In China they consider one band a positive result. In Canada you need 5 to 7, because there are 2 bands that are actually not counted. So you might actually need 7 bands in Canada to be considered a positive test. But the public lab, the National Microbiology Lab, currently does not release the band patterns back to the doctors. So this is why people pay to take their blood to California, because the California lab will send you the underlying banding patterns, and somebody who's experienced with this disease can look at the different banding patterns. Some are very specific to Lyme, some are not as specific to Lyme. So if you have 4 bands, for example, you will be told in Canada, negative. You get a sheet with 1 word on it, negative. You don't know that you had 4 bands, or maybe you had 6 bands. You don't know that, and this is why people spend $500, $600, $1,000 to send their blood to get the same test, because they get those banding patterns back. And if you have a history of exposure to ticks, or you have consistent symptomology, and then you look at a test and you see you have 4 bands, well, now your doctor can use that information to help make a clinical diagnosis, which is what doctors are supposed to be doing. And that is one of the reasons why people have to go out and get a test outside of Canada.
And often when they do get that test outside of Canada and they bring it to their doctor, they are told, and I can say this is in these comments over and over again, you have wasted your money, you have paid for a positive test. We will not see you. Doctors decline patients with tests from outside of Canada, and they say those are bad, invalid, and it just goes on. And so these patients are basically told, you don't have Lyme disease, you paid for a positive test, the test in Canada is negative, go away. And it's shocking. And so these patients are forced, if they have the funding, to go to the U.S. or even into Europe to find a doctor who is willing to treat them so that they can get better and be productive members of Canadian society again. And this is happening all across this country. It's despicable. I can tell you it is happening, and we need to do something about it.
Sorry to cut off. I think we're going to lose the interpretation, so I just have one more question from Cheryl Gallant, and then we can move on, unless you want to...
Thank you. It's along the same lines as Diane. We're 7.5 hours northwest of where she is. We've got a handful of people that I know of with Lyme, and they go to Rochester. But what I've been told is that if their doctor treats them after the first few weeks when the inflammation is no longer showing, they can have their license revoked. So why would anyone go to a seminar or learn more about Lyme disease if that's what's at risk?
And that's a serious problem, and that's happening right across Canada. And so we're almost at 100% of Canadian physicians having been harassed out of the business altogether, or have been told not to see any more Lyme patients. So it's outrageous what's been allowed to happen. And I think we as the public have got to take back some of the power we've given to this medical community. We gave them through legislation the right to self-police and monitor themselves. They are abusing that right. They are not applying appropriate science. They're not applying appropriate evidence. They're not listening to patients and their experts, and we are all suffering as a people. Do you realize, and I think Jennifer and I were talking just earlier, and she was mentioning that I think she counted 68 doctors that she had been to trying to get a diagnosis I myself, to try to get my diagnosis, was to every type of specialist there was, and I was sick for years. It's costing us, our system, a fortune to not diagnose this and treat this disease appropriately. So we as a society, you as legislators, we've got to revisit this, and we can't just let it slide, and certainly 5 years is too long. We need to review the framework in 3 years.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry to have to cut it off. I hope that some of you will be able to maybe stay for a bit in the hall and have some conversations if other MPs have questions. I really want to sincerely thank all of you for coming. Both, you know, I'd like to really thank both of the young people here, because I think it's important that we hear your voices, and you both did fantastic and a great job today. And I also want to thank all the advocacy groups that couldn't be here. I know this was supported by the New Brunswick Lyme Disease Association, l'Association Québécoise de la Maladie de Lyme, Nova Scotia Lyme Support Group, Vocal Ottawa, Ontario Lyme Alliance, Lyme Ontario, Lyme Disease Association of Alberta, and the Saskatchewan Lyme Disease Association. And unfortunately, the reason that all of these groups exist is because there is often no place else for Lyme patients to go. So they have to find one of your amazing groups to be able to navigate this and feel heard on what they're facing. So thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to keeping in touch in the future. Thank you.